Since the loss of about 1,000 votes from last year's Senate election, WA will be going back to the polls soon. This got me thinking about not only who I'd vote for, but whether I had a good reason for supporting any of the parties. The received wisdom is that you should vote for the party that you agree most with, which seems like a sound principle. The idea is that you compare your values with the policy platform or track record of each party and vote for the one that most closely matches. There is a practical problem of finding what mathematicians would call a suitable metric for measuring how close each party is to your values, but most of us manage to overcome this. However, the vote your values idea is built on the relativistic idea that all values are equal. That is, that there is no objective difference between the values of the major parties, and so it's just a matter of personal preference. This is not true. Different values lead to different policies, and these policies will, theoretically, have a measurable impact on the quality of our society. This led me to approach the problem differently. Suppose that we could place the countries of the world on some kind of continuum that represented their society's values. Similarly, the major political parties could also be placed on this continuum, and we could look at the countries that are similar in values to our political parties, and use these countries as examples of how Australia might look if those political parties could implement their policies. That is, we look at the countries of the world that best represent our political party's ideals. For example, the Sex Party's ideal might turn out to be something like the Netherlands, so we could judge the Sex Party on how the Netherlands is performing. The other insight I had was that this is not just a matter of personal preference which countries are to be preferred. There are objective reasons why it is better to live in Australia than in Afghanistan. Therefore, we can use some objective ranking of countries to distinguish between societies that each party is advocating for. So, okay, this isn't a perfect measure, but the idea of it is to go some way towards removing some of the more emotional elements of comparing political parties. Now, the first hurdle is to find a comparison of the major political parties by ideology. The de facto standard for measuring political ideologies is on two axes, social conservatism usually at the bottom to liberalism at the top, and economic conservatism on the right to economic liberalism on the left. I took this image from the ABC's Vote Compass. One thing to notice is that even though it has two axes, the major parties in our country really only exist along one axis, that is one that's running in a straight line from the top right to the bottom left. Now, we need a comparison of the world's countries by ideology, and this was much harder to find. I couldn't find any scholarly comparisons which used the two-axis social and economic measures that we use for people and parties. What I did find was some excellent research from the World Values Survey, which uses a slightly different two-axis model. They use survival values versus self-expression values, and traditional values versus secular rational values. Check it out here. To map our parties onto the countries of the world, we first need to understand what the axes of this World Values Survey mean. Now, if we dig into the research, we find that the vertical axis is basically socially conservative at the bottom and socially liberal at the top. So far so good. Now, the horizontal axis is materialist values on the left and post-materialist values on the right. Now, in this context, materialist values are centred on economic growth and physical security, while post-materialist values emphasise environmental protection and civil rights, such as gay marriage and gender equality. Now, in the context of Australian politics, the materialist values align fairly well with the political right, and the post-materialist values align with the political left. Note that these stances are very much relative to the status quo in Australia. Obviously, the Australian political right would be seen as socialists by much of the American political right. So, let's superimpose our political parties on our countries of the world. The party map needs to be reflected horizontally to match the country's map, and here is the result. What can be seen is that the values espoused by the Liberal and National parties best aligns with a shift towards the societies of Britain, Northern Ireland, or Ireland. The values of the Labour Party would shift us towards something like Switzerland or Ireland, and the values of the Greens would shift us towards Denmark or Sweden, perhaps. So let's try and pick some representative countries for each party. For the Liberals, I'll use the UK. For Labour, I'll use Switzerland. And for the Greens, I'll use Sweden. So, in my rough analysis, the three countries we have to choose from are the UK, Switzerland, and Sweden. In order to try and be somewhat objective in comparing these countries, let's use something called the Quality of Life Index. The scores for each of the three countries in the most recent index comes out as the UK at 6.9, Switzerland at 8.1, and Sweden at 7.9. So based on that analysis, my preferences should be Labour, the Greens, and then Liberal. And in fact, insofar as this analysis is supposedly objective, those should be the preferences for all people. So, if the preferences are Labour, Greens, and then Liberal, why would I be a Greens voter? Well, firstly, note that the scores for Labour at 8.1 and the Greens at 7.9 are very close. And in fact, so close that the differences are almost certainly insignificant compared to the other factors inherent in comparing different countries on the basis of their cultures. So I believe that this analysis only really suggests that the left-wing parties and their policies are intended to move Australia in a way which would improve our quality of life. And that there are few objective reasons for differentiating between the Greens and Labour. In practice, they tend to vote similarly and they advocate similar positions. So, why am I voting Green? Well, I'm a Greens voter mainly because the left-wing parties are actually moving this country in a direction which improves our quality of life. And I have a general preference for the Greens' policies, and I think it's important to have more than two parties in the political landscape here. So, there you go. Vote left or you're un-Australian.